there is a war going on. A war uglier than any crime that man has perpetrated against man, because we now have the technology to threaten life itself. Governments in Canada are tripping over themselves to give away one of the world's last great wildernesses to pulp mill development. Most people have no idea of the speed and scale at which the Canadian government has moved to commit our forests to be pulped. The black areas on this map represent the areas proposed or committed since only January 1, 1989. The gray areas are those areas that have been committed up until '89, and the light green areas are considered too sparse and slow growing to be of any value. This monster is called a faller buncher. It aggravates soil compaction, destroys the understory, displaces workers, but the multinationals like its impact on quarterly profits, so of course it's the harvesting method of preference. This gross scene is taking place all over Canada, but this particular one is deep within the boundaries of Wood Buffalo National Park, designated a UN World Heritage Site and a park that the Canadian government proudly proclaims as an example of its commitment to environmental protection. If you or I were to pick a single wild flower in a national park, we'd be subject to prosecution. But to our governments, if the park is remote enough to be removed from public scrutiny, then this sort of lunacy is considered acceptable behavior.
This whole exercise is an exercise in deicide, because you can't live in this community, you can't live with northerners without feeling the spirit of the place. It's alive. The river's alive, the bush is alive. And I think any proposal that is going to take 100,000 square kilometers and clear cut it is the death of the bush. It's the death of the spirit. And in a very real way, it's the death of God.
This isn't a unicorn, though it's almost as rare. It's a woodland caribou, depending on the old coniferous forest in northern Alberta for protection and for the lichens that grow only on the century-old spruce trees. In 1982, the Alberta Fish and Wildlife Department designated the woodland caribou a threatened species. They proposed to revitalize caribou populations by protecting 5 critical caribou ranges. Ironically, this very same department handed over these 5 critical ranges to 4 different pulp companies. The caribou have steadily been growing fewer in number over the past 8 years. With all the new pulp developments proposed and ongoing in northern Alberta, this beautiful creature may well be extinct within the lifetime of our children.
When man and machine move in with the motive of maximizing short-term profit, the inevitable consequence will be devastation. Disrupting forests on the scale that is required to feed the massive mills impacts on water quality through increased erosion, siltation, oxygen deprivation, and the addition of toxins. Soils are compacted and deprived of nutrients and eroded away. Air has its carbon and moisture cycles disrupted, its contaminant levels increased. The creatures of the forest live in symbiotic balances. When their habitat is removed, they cease to exist. They can't simply scamper over into another's territory, and they don't have to be scarce for their very existence to be threatened. These are actual excerpts from a video produced by the Alberta Department of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife. Those same people the public entrusts with the protection of our wild creatures and forests. It was made with public money, but was not intended for public consumption. Its audience was to be the international business community. its message that Alberta forests were theirs for the taking.
Very good. How about that?
While very real worries grow about the problems of deforestation, species depletion, and toxic contamination, while people struggle with the mess made by existing mills, and hundreds of millions of our tax dollars are spent in a desperate effort to detoxify the Great Lakes, the Pacific Coast fisheries, and the rivers of British Columbia, wild creatures like this pileated woodpecker will disappear with the old-growth forests that the government is so desperate to sell. While doctors warn of the dangers that existing toxins pose to the health of our great-great-great-great-grandchildren, what would possess a government to actively pursue this type of development?
One place, with all these attributes, stands ready for development. Alberta. Alberta.
I can't think of a place in the world which has the two most important ingredients, trees and power.
One clue may be found in this government video. Its heroes are business executives ensconced in high-rise office towers, removed from the wonder of forest ecosystems, rewarded with money and prestige. Their egos refuse to accept that their hard work may be contributing to the planet's destruction.
Great little cottage out here, make you forget all about Bay Street. For a day or so anyway.
Another clue may be in the relationship between government and industry.
Gives you that. Dealing with the Alberta Forest Service is like dealing with businessmen. They understand the profit motive. They have a responsibility to the public to manage the forest properly, etc., that type of thing. But because they're professionals and with an industry background, they're more in tune with the investor and what the investor needs or requires.
These scenes may look good to those who see trees as standing logs, but I don't think it's the future the Canadian public sees for our wilderness. Human arrogance shouldn't replace understanding.
The Alberta Forest Service and the forest products industry use genetics to ensure a continuing abundant supply of superior logs for the forest industries in Alberta.
Our government and industry stubbornly promote the conviction that human engineering and genetics can substitute for what took nature millions of years to evolve. And they insist on conducting their rash experiment on our entire boreal forest. Perhaps the explanation for this type of development lies in the incredible power and influence of the multinationals themselves. Mitsubishi, for example, has annual sales that exceed Canada's gross national product. Whatever the explanation, one fact is transparently obvious. Like so many marionettes, our politicians are dancing to industry's tunes.
We don't have to have these mega projects that basically are highly automated and taking down a whole ecosystem. We're taking down the forests of this nation at the same rate they're taking down the Amazon. Every 5 seconds, we are clear-cutting and burning an acre. 90% of all the projects in this nation are clear-cut logging.
It's very important that we get out there and argue vigorously about the fact that these are lands owned by Canadians. They're not owned by Daishawa. They're not owned by any other particular mining or gas company or anyone else. There are lands that have a significant prior title in terms of Aboriginal title, but in many cases, Aboriginal people, if not in most cases, have proven to be better curators of the land than we collectively have been.
Industry is not going to easily want to change, and whatever the system is doing out there is catering to that large multinational concept. And what we have to do is say, okay, if you want to do business in this country, in this province, you have to quit ripping off the resources. You can do business here, but you have to create jobs and you have to sustain the forests. And we have to make money. Did you know that we're only making 2 cents a cubic meter on the forests of the nation, or this province right now? And the years from 1982 to 1986, we lost over $1 billion as taxpayers. We're actually subsidizing the multinationals right now. And we have to question, if we're spending $1 billion in subsidies, why don't we put that $1 billion into developing things in our community so that we can sustain the forest, that we can have those smaller technologies, whether they be pulp mills or logging, that are appropriate and that sustain the forests.
This has become a case of the tail wagging the dog, and it's damn time we put it back into perspective. There are many nations of the world who won't accept such toxic effluent. It's not an acceptable cost of doing business, so why should we accept it? Does Alberta value its natural environment any less than Tasmania that won't hold for this? Are they more advanced in their perspectives and philosophy than ours? Yes, they are.
If you want to count the number of fish that you can eat in a year by the degree of toxins in them and wonder what level of safe toxins you can consume, and there are no levels of safe toxins depending on what manuals tell you there are none. And if you want to live in an environment like that where you can't take a drink of water and your child can't play in the soil, can't breathe the air, is afraid to wade in the water, come to see me afterwards and I'll tell you where you can move. But I live in Alberta and I don't want to see it here.
I think the big issue is not that much different from the issue in any third world country, and I have to say that Canada is becoming a third world country like Malaysia. It's basically the foreign multinationals versus the indigenous people, and I think people like ourselves have to decide which side we're on.
Let's look at just two of the latest proposed holdings for the Japanese companies of Daishawa and Mitsubishi Honshu. Alberta Pacific. You know how big the 100,000 square kilometers is that's been granted to just those two? It's larger than the land areas combined of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, Massachusetts, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, all added together, just to those two companies. And we've just given that away, or want to. And how could we dare be so arrogant as to believe we could give up a chunk of our public land heritage, the combined size of all those places, without even talking it over with the people involved? And without even knowing what you're giving away.
Farmers, trappers, outfitters, natives, many were concerned about the impacts on traditional uses of the forest that these new mills would have. Some of the most devastating evidence was introduced by the scientific community. While the scientists who were paid by Alberta Pacific for the company environmental impact assessment were playing down the effects of the 1,500 kilograms per day of organochlorides and other toxins that the company proposed to dump into the Athabasca River, fisheries scientists from the Federal Department of the Environment introduced studies conducted in Sweden.
Dr. Merla studied the uptake of TCBD, one of the dioxins, into the fish, and he found that as he exposed the fish over 28 days, they built up a factor of about 25,000 times higher in the fish than what they were in the water.
The company-sponsored myth that these toxins could somehow magically be diluted to non-detectable levels, which wouldn't adversely affect health, was also debunked by Dr. Lockhart.
They saw some of their biological effects there. At this site, 4.5 kilometers away in the Baltic Sea, 300 and some odd fold dilution, and they still have their effects. At this site, 8 kilometers away, 1,140-fold dilution, and they still have it.
The Swedish observations of birth defects, immune deficiencies, and reproductive failures also showed up in Canadian studies of pulp mills on British Columbia's rivers.
We found quite high amounts of dioxin, 68 parts per trillion, 300 and some odd parts per trillion of the furan. This figure was a great surprise to me. I had no idea it would be that high.
Even the workers, the supposed beneficiaries, weren't so keen on this type of development. Mr. Rolf Nielsen, representing the 3 million members of the Canadian Labour Congress, rejected the mills out of concern for workers' health. He also had this to say: "The pattern of development represented by the proposed Athabasca pulp mill is the ugliest, most primitive, and uneconomical form of raw resource extraction. The model of economic development would have a slightly processed resource shipped to developed countries which can then enjoy the benefits of this process, which leaves all of the byproduct, effluvium, and environmental damage far away in Alberta." Dr. Murray, representing the Alberta Medical Association's 4,400 doctors, expressed his concerns. The company toxicologist has tried to play down the dangers of dioxins and furans, but notwithstanding the evidence exhibited by the company toxicologist, the scientific literature is replete with solid evidence of the extreme toxicity of PCDDs and PCDFs. Given the omnipresence of these chemicals in our environment, it is imperative that all sources of these chemicals be controlled so that background environmental concentrations are not further elevated.
In June of 1990, the Provincial Department of the Environment issued a license to operate to the Dashawa Bleach Craft Pulp Mill, in full knowledge that the toxins that will be spewed into the Peace River will poison the river, the fish, the animals, and the people who live downstream from the mill. In a very real way, this can be considered an act of premeditated murder. None of this insanity is necessary. There are alternatives. Alternatives to clear-cut logging, alternatives to environmental contamination, and alternative economic strategies.
We've taken our public forests, the forests which sustain us, and given them away, lock, stock, and barrel, largely to large multinational corporations in a tenure system, in a series of in a system of long-term leases, be they forest licenses or tree farm licenses. We will not solve the problems of forest use in British Columbia until that tenure system is gone.
I feel that alternative forms of forestry are the answer, where we can have forests, where we can use them, where we can keep people employed, and where we still have a thing of beauty that we can sell to people on the side and sell it to them every year. To me, that's better business than making one cut.
Those pests are as much a part of that ecosystem and need to be maintained in that ecosystem as the things that we think are good about it. Because if we don't, we're going to take away some of the web that makes that system work. Look at our ridiculous efforts to control the mountain pine beetle. We've never controlled it because you can't control it. And in fact, what we've done is destroy a lot of good forests in ill-conceived ideas of how you deal with the mountain pine beetle problem. Look at things like the fact that when you slash burn a site and clear cut it, you destroy some of the fungus in the soil that are associated with the roots of trees and other plants that are called mycorrhizae. Those mycorrhizae that you destroyed are also the fungi that provide everything from antibiotics to physical barriers for other fungi that rot the roots of some of those trees. So we don't really know completely what the role of some of the root-rotting fungi are in that system, but we do know they have a role. And for us to try to eradicate them, control them, or deal with them in very heavy fashions means we're going to cause a lot more problems. There aren't pests in the forest. The only pest in the forest is us.
Craft mills are already obsolete.
One of the most scandalous examples of government and industry hostility to innovative alternatives involves Tigny technology from Edmonton, Alberta. Ted DeLong has invented a revolutionary steam explosion process which allows him to break down the chemical bonds in wood fibers to produce pure cellulose and make use of wood's other constituents without the massive energy and pollution problems associated with conventional pulp mills. Because the technique will also work for bagasse, the wasted byproduct of sugarcane, he may have made a major contribution towards solving the problems of deforestation and pollution associated with supplying the world's appetite for fiber and fuel. The Soviet Union and Norway's cooperative woodlot owners are embracing the new technology, but he has fought the multinationals and their government sidekicks every inch of the way.
No one has the right, whether democratically elected governments or tin pot dictatorships, to pursue policies that impact on the health of the planet. Decisions made by transient regional governments extend beyond their jurisdiction, both geographically and in time. Wildlife species are migratory. Water and air cross political boundaries. Toxins are long-lived, and their effects extend well beyond the mandate of the present government. Albertans are doing everything we can to influence our government, which seems either not to care or so deeply committed financially and philosophically to these projects that they can't reverse their position. We need your help. If a wealthy democracy like Canada can't protect her wilderness, there is very little hope for our survival as a species. We need the help of the international community. The corporations and governments think only of real or imagined short-term economic gain. We have to stop them now. They have to be made to understand that the international community will not tolerate this mindless destruction.
Mitsubishi is the company that is behind the Alpac mill, and they have another Canadian name, actually, Crestbrook Industries. And last fall, when the Alpac hearings were taking place, I happened to get hold of some documentation through Probe International outlining the record of the Mitsubishi Corporation around the world and their deforestation practices in such places as Thailand and Sarawak, Malaysia, where they've been leaving deserts for years. It's a good thing to be polite, but I thought that perhaps there was enough people being polite that there was room for a rude boy. It's called Mitsubishi Go Home. Go home, Mitsubishi, and take your mercenary pimps who will say anything for a price. You've raped Thailand and Malaysia and our neighbors BC, and now you want our northern paradise. Ha! Go home, Crestbrook Alpac, and take your sordid little plans to dirty up our rivers with your greed. Commit harry-carry now and get it over with, for poison and dishonor are your creed. Lord, Lord, for poison and dishonor are your creed. Mitsubishi go home, 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 Mitsubishi go home. Clean water, give us cool, clean water. What good's a job if there's no